cold. She doesn't look like she's maybe willing to be there. Something looked weird. They were forcing her to wear a wig. Just all of these weird things that didn't really fit with a 15-year-old girl. And none of those were illegal by any means. Like, anyone can walk down the street and can wear that, and they're not doing anything wrong. Her kidnappers didn't have a knife to her neck at that point. They didn't have like a gun and they were forcing her to walk. Nothing was illegal. It's that resource that empowers individuals on how to look out for those signs of something seems wrong with this situation. This is how we're gonna fix it. Okay, we're gonna talk a little bit more about it. Real quick. Can experience trafficking without ever physically being touched. So when you think of camming, when you think of OnlyFans, when you think of things like that, you never know what's going on behind the camera. We've worked with several survivors who they were being forced into doing certain videos online, into taking pictures online, into doing that stuff, and while they were never touched, they are actually a victim of sex trafficking. Any questions on that? Cool.
Yeah, we are having some audio difficulties. So people could
That's not a question.
On YouTube.
Okay.
So if you could just refresh like the first 2 minutes real quick into 30 seconds of what you said for them online.
Yes, like the whole thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. OnWatch is a program by Malou Foundation designed to confront sexual exploitation. We focus specifically on sex trafficking and online abuse. A way that we do that is focusing on education, mass community education to know everyone should be doing this, and then we do healing and advocacy for the individual survivor. OnWatch is our flagship education program that focuses specifically on how to look out for signs of sex trafficking so we can educate, raise awareness, and help prevent it. Elizabeth Smart is a big advocate for it because she was rescued by brave individuals who saw certain signs of things that didn't look right. They called and they reported it. And because of that, that's why we have certain programs like OnWatch to help understand those signs. And we're back here.
Perfect.
Is that good?
Yeah,
okay.
awesome. Thank you.
Very good.
That was amazing, actually.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about some stats. First off, human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. So something that, when you think about it, drug trade, guns, all of those things, those are illegal activities that exist. The drug industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. These individuals like taking advantage of opportunity for funding and for money. Oftentimes, drug dealers will end up being sex traffickers because they see opportunity. So as other billion-dollar industries grow, sex trafficking continues to grow. Additionally, when we look at certain trafficking individuals, the majority of them are being trafficked over and over again, oftentimes like several times a day. And so this industry, it's not just trading something once, it's not goods for product or goods for money, it's goods for money over and over and over again on the same person. So that's why it is such a big industry and why it's such a big problem. It's reported in all 50 states, definitely here in Utah, we're gonna talk about that. Something that I don't love is that 40% of child sex trafficking victims are sold by a family member. So for 4 out of 10 of every single trafficking survivor, they're sold by a family member. They're sold by someone who's supposed to love and care for them. They're sold by a parent, aunt and uncle, cousin, sibling, something like that. That's something that we see over and over again. We most often see like stepdads, parents, often parents together, and then uncles is actually really common as well. According to 2023 Global Slavery Index stats, over 1 million people living in conditions of trafficking right now. The average age for trafficking is 13 years old. So this actually, just like 10-ish years ago, it was 17 years old. So this number continues to drop at, honestly, a really scary pace. We're currently working with like 3 trafficking survivor kids. We actually just finished a room restoration for them. 18 months, 8, and 13. So 18 months. So, sorry, they started being trafficked at 18 months. They were trafficked for 18 months. The child's now 3 years old, but they started at 18 months. And this was by their stepdad. Their stepdad was also sex trafficking the mother. No idea.
When you talk about conditions, what does that mean as far as living in conditions? Like, what do you define those conditions as?
That's a good question. I'll repeat that question. So Garrett asked what we can define as those people living in conditions. So those are currently people that are living in trafficking. So it's not like a one-time circumstance. They're currently being forced to be trafficked or to be sexually abused over and over again.
So it could be their home or somebody else's home, doesn't matter where.
That's a great question. A lot of people picture trafficking as overseas. They picture them like taking these people physically out of their homes, stealing them away from parents, and then taking them to some unknown destination. A lot of times there's like shipping containers involved. That's rarely true. A lot of times these individuals are in their own homes and they're being trafficked, by their parents in their own homes. I've seen a lot of like dance studios. I've seen a lot of elementary schools, middle schools. A lot of times these people live at home, and yet they're being trafficked and then still going home at night. Any other questions? That was a good question.
Yeah, what do you mean by elementary schools, middle schools? Like,
a lot of teachers take advantage of children, especially as social media continues to grow. And so they're being exploited on their cell phones. Is a lot of like CSAM, so child sexual abuse material. They're being forced to take those pictures. They're being forced to provide some sort of sexual relations with an elementary school teacher or other staff member. It's really common in Utah, actually. We've seen a handful of cases in Utah every year. And usually it's like one teacher with 13, 15 kids who they're doing the same thing to. Sorry, this is really heavy. Any other questions? So to maybe just like go into that a little bit more, child sex trafficking victims virtually always know their traffickers. So these people aren't strangers. Like, who all has seen Sound of Freedom? I didn't want to bring that up, but like Sound of Freedom, like where they were literally just kidnapped away from their dad. That is not often. They often are, like I said, family members, or there's someone that they trust. So we see a lot of coaches. I just did one of these trainings a few weeks ago in Cedar City, and it was a dance studio down in St. George. For 11 years, this kid was trafficked by his dance studio's teacher's husband, and several other victims have come out about it as well. This is one that we're going to talk a little bit about in the training, but the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC is what it's called. It's also like missingkids.org. It's John Walsh's organization, all that fun stuff. Of those 25,000 cases of reported children missing in 2022 who had run away, most people ignore runaways. They think it's their choice. 1 in 6 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. So when you think of all those teenagers who were runaways, who went to live with their boyfriend, went to do that kind of stuff, they were often groomed by a trafficker, and they end up in this life of sex trafficking at a really young age. To follow into that, grooming and enticement, it continues to change over and over again, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but most of it is done online right now, and most of it is done through a grooming process where there's this method of trust involved, whether it's through like a boyfriending situation, which we're going to talk about, or some kind of like good or service is involved in providing that trust. That's how sex trafficking is currently happening most of the time today. And then, while it can happen to anyone, we're going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities, especially like certain individuals, certain groups, certain populations that are far more vulnerable to trafficking than others. Any other questions? I like showing this because most of the trainings I do are either on the East Coast or in California. But Utah actually, like our whole northern Utah area is pretty big, and we actually have a very large number of underreported cases. So we're definitely seen as one of those hotspots, especially by population. And as of 2021, Utah ranked number 4 in the country for human trafficking by population. So even though like Florida is a whole cesspool down there of lots of red, by population, like Utah, we're pretty sparse, but that one heavy area of northern Utah brings us up to number 4 because of that.
Is Nevada really hardly on the map?
Because so much of it is legal there. It's kind of a weird gray area, physically and metaphorically, yes. Any other questions? Something else that's really interesting, yes?
I'm actually curious, do you know if there's any data surrounding why, you know, because we're smack dab in the middle of nowhere in comparison to all these other states, right? Is there any data surrounding why Utah?
Okay, so the question was, why Utah? When you look at all of these, you could definitely tell these are like port cities, these are major vacation hotspots, all that, and then Utah is kind of random in the middle. Is that a good representation of your question? Something that's really interesting is this represents all of human trafficking in North Carolina and Florida and Georgia, places that are very big hotspots for trafficking. It's about a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split based on the state for sex and labor trafficking. So a lot of these individuals are recruited into the United States and are forced into labor trafficking, and oftentimes both, but most of the time it's labor trafficking. Utah, no, I didn't even put it. Virtually all trafficking in Utah is sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. So 82% of our trafficking is just sex trafficking. We're one of the highest for that specific need. 9% is labor trafficking, and then the other 9%, I had to do fast math, is both of those. And so that's one of the reasons is that we don't have that labor trafficking side. Another reason is we are a state with a lot of multifamily living, with large families who we place very high trust in adults close to us. We are raised to like trust your family, trust adults, and because of that, we see a lot. It also, I believe, starts with, I'm gonna skip ahead really quickly, 1 in 4 children in Utah are sexually abused before they turn 18. Nationally, that's 1 in 6. 1 in 4 are reported here in Utah. Then the next bullet, 89% of trafficking survivors were first abused as children. So when you look at really high rates of child sexual abuse, going into trafficking, the likeliness of that being a hotspot starts to like paint a more clear picture.
Regardless of what religion, do you feel like religion plays a factor in any of the states?
Yes. So question was asked, Libby asked, about religion playing a factor. Any religion? Yes. Religion, regardless of what religion, any sort of trust that children are instilling in older adults provides this advantage that older adults can take. There's predators everywhere, right? Like, who has looked at the predator list on their, searched their address and looked at predators who live nearby? Like, there's predators everywhere. You look at how much child sex abuse material, child pornography is out on the internet. There is this very strong need for this, like need by these predators. There's this strong want, and any individual who has an advantage to like take advantage of children if they are one of those people, they will. So yeah, we see that a lot. No religion specifically, just religion as blanket. Good question. To discuss a few that we hadn't talked about. So we've talked a little bit about this just with Vital in general, but to maybe show a little bit of the, I guess, want out there for this, we did a sting operation. We funded it for one weekend, Valentine's weekend in 2022. So it was about a year and a half ago, and we paid, it was like $60,000, but we paid for 48 hours of overtime for police officers, gave them what they needed. One weekend, we arrested 21 predators in Utah County with the intent to traffic individuals. 3 victims of trafficking were rescued, and the other ones, luckily, they never had to enter that because they were arrested prior. But that was one weekend in Provo and Orem exclusively that we did that. And so it shows a little bit of just how much it's out there. Additionally, like this last bullet point, there's hundreds of victims a year in Utah, which seems really small. About 200 are reported annually. However, we fund privately a group in Salt Lake that helps work with sex trafficking survivors while they're currently being trafficked, and then they help them leave that by working discreetly through covert operations. They work with around an additional 200 to 300 a year that are never reported. And that's just in downtown Salt Lake, and those are just teenagers and women in their early 20s. So these are all underreported, so we know that this is crazy underreported, but those are numbers put out by the AG's office every year. Any questions specifically about Utah? Sorry, that was heavy.
When you talk about the intent to traffic, what is the definition of intent?
Intent to traffic. That means that they had knowledge that an individual was a minor with intent to do sexual acts, and or they sent sexual images to them with the intent of meeting them. And then it was a variety of options. Some of it actually was taking them. Some of it, it's doing sexual acts to them. Some of it, it's having individuals pay to do sexual acts. So we've seen all of those. Yes?
You said you work with people who are currently being trafficked. What is the biggest prevention of just them getting out of it or reporting that individual? Like, why are they still in it while they're working with you sometimes?
That's a great question. So that specific operation we do, I don't want to say it because this is on YouTube and I don't want to like kind of blow up this entire sting up like undercover thing that we do. But a lot of them don't realize that they're being trafficked. So that's something that we're going to talk a little bit about in this presentation more. If you were to go up to somebody who they currently are being forced to have sex with somebody 1 to 2 times a day for a week, and you said, hey, are you a victim of trafficking? Can I help you get out? They would say no. Like a lot of them don't understand and they don't relate to that. They may not know what it means. They don't see themselves as that because of the grooming process that so many traffickers do. They feel like this is their boyfriend or somebody who cares about them, you're trying to be, as a team, get the life that you deserve. So you are a 17-year-old girl who is helping your 25-year-old boyfriend have a better life for yourself. And so that's what they see it as. One of the stories that we'll talk about, Julie, the best way that she could describe what was currently happening to her is she said, I have a boyfriend who requires me to share. She would not describe what happened to her as trafficking. I've seen that so many times where people, they've actually even like gone out and done fundraisers for groups like OUR, and they were like, let's stop trafficking. And then it wasn't until years of therapy when they were like, oh yeah, like, you know, this girl met me and she kind of invited me into like their group of friends, and they paid my rent while I was getting on my feet as a runaway. And then, you know, a month later, they said, hey, you have to help us provide. And I ended up being forced to have sex like 5-6 times a day. And then eventually they were taken out of their apartment and being put in this house. And they really saw this as there's a tight-knit community. and then it kind of like goes into this weird gray space of I don't like what's happening, but I can't get out of it. So a lot of people don't define themselves as currently being trafficked.
When you're talking, obviously we're talking Utah, and there's like a big religious institution, but just in general, when you're talking like a big organization, if there's somebody in that organization that's like that's promoting sex trafficking or is a sex trafficker or something like that, is that harder to get to those individuals because of the organization, or does it just not matter?
Yeah, okay, so you asked about like if it's a big organization that runs trafficking versus just
Yeah,
one
if it's an
guy on the
individual
street
that's
who-
like, we're trying to protect him because he's top and coming or something like that.
Yeah, it is much harder to get to those individuals. Like the obvious thing I think raises awareness is like Jeffrey Epstein, right? He got away with it for how many years? Because he was powerful enough and wealthy enough and had enough people on his side to really kind of push all of those things away. That continues to happen. There are, for every like drug dealing, living on the street, trafficker who's kind of like seen as one of those pimps, there's traffickers who are very legit, very wealthy businessmen who they have levels of their operations. I mean, it's kind of like trying to get to the top drug dealer, right? Like it's really easy to understand what it looks like at the bottom, but there's so many layers of protection and so many levels that it's difficult. We've worked with a survivor who she was trafficked by an individual right in Alpine. Prominent business leader, tried pressing charges, but without adequate proof. Yeah, it was just dismissed.
You're in Utah. Have you seen any different levels of safety between like public school, charter schools, private schools? Like, we're trying to put our kids in the same spot, you know?
Yeah. That's a good question. So the difference of like public schools versus private schools versus charter schools, I will say that there is no difference. I personally haven't seen enough cases to like know one way or the other. However, I don't think that there's a difference in the survivors that I've spoken with. Kind of like those adults who look for opportunity to prey on a child. Those exist everywhere. And yeah, that's all I'll say. I think there's definitely these, like I was mentioning, wealthier traffickers, right? Who they do it as this kind of like esteemed thing, and then there's these individuals who take advantage of very vulnerable kids, kids who are in the foster care system, things like that. Those are more often in public schools, but I think it happens regardless. Okay, any other questions? So one of the stories that we're going to watch is Julie's story. She's actually going to be speaking during the next grind, but her story is really kind of this perfect OnWatch model of how we want our community members to see this resource. There were so many times where Julie asked for help. She was seen by so many people as her not wanting to be there. She was seen as this individual who she asked for help a handful of times, and she was ignored by them. And there was one person who saw something that didn't seem right in her story and really had this feeling and this drive to continue pushing and continue asking questions and continuing seeing if he could help. And he ended up actually being able to help her get out of that trafficking situation. And because of that, they actually go around the country and they talk about OnWatch and the importance of it. But that's really what OnWatch is to help that one person who you might see in your life, who you might, maybe pass by. I've heard like hundreds of stories of someone who they remember something that they saw in an airport, or they remember someone about a child who they knew growing up, or they have a neighbor who they maybe see something off. We're really looking to save that individual. This is what I want for Vital. We've talked about it. But an OnWatch certified organization, when you become an advocate, it's when 90% of your group completes the OnWatch training. FYI, we've talked about a ton of heavy stuff, and I always feel weird throwing this in the middle, but these videos that we're about to watch, they do discuss all these very true stories of sexual assault, of things like individuals were raped, domestic violence, stuff like that. So don't feel the need to stay, don't feel the need to continue watching. Okay, we're gonna go to the videos now. Any questions while these load? Perfect. So we're gonna go through a handful of these. I always like starting with talking about child sex abuse and familial trafficking. We talked about how it's 40% of trafficking and what that looks like. So we're gonna watch this video, we're gonna talk a little bit about it, and then we're gonna go to the next one. Sorry, next one.
Oh, the next one?
Yes, if that's okay.
Have to go through.
So if you just go down to the bottom and press back, and then yes, module 2. We can watch the introduction, but we talked about a lot of it. Okay.
My uncle was abused as a child. That is no excuse, period. The minute he touched me inappropriately, he was no longer innocent. He was no longer the victim. The minute he abused someone else, he shouldered the guilt of his own behavior. What happened to him as a child was not his fault, but what he did to me was. Every night after my parents went to bed, my uncle scooped me out of bed, took me to his house next door, and sold me for $300 per buyer. I went to school. I would stare at the paper on my desk with heavy eyes. Sometimes my uncle would come to my school. My teacher would see me quietly panicking. I tried telling her my uncle wasn't supposed to pick me up. He would pull me out into the hallway to threaten or abuse me, and then I would creep back into class, still dissociated from his cruelty. There were adults in my life that saw things, but I guess they didn't know what they were looking at. My babysitter watched me resist every time she tried taking off the jacket that was covering the bruises and cuts on my arms. Over the years, my doctor witnessed me going from trusting him to flinching at his touch to completely withdrawing into myself. I get asked, where are my parents? How did they not know? Well, my dad's job never changed during that time, but the more I was sold, the more money my parents seemed to have. One day it clicked that my parents received kickbacks for my abuse, and now I struggle with that reality every day.
It's not enough to know Hope's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. To the outside world, Hope came from a normal family. Her dad was a firefighter, and her mom stayed at home. Her trafficker was a local business owner, and his wife was on the school board. To some people, her abuse seemed unlikely, maybe even impossible. Her teachers saw a sleepy child who always seemed to forget things and got pulled out of school a lot. To her neighbors, Hope was a mischievous girl, sneaking out when her parents weren't looking to play on the swings. Late at night, long after all the kids had gone in for the evening, she would be in the park across the street from her house, swinging to escape her reality. Her pediatrician thought she just hadn't slept well last night. Her friend's mom thought she was an affectionate and talkative child, never noticing her longing for someone to pay attention. To her babysitter, Hope was a strong-willed child who insisted her parents let her dress herself, always donning her favorite long-sleeve princess shirt, even in 100-degree weather. They thought Hope was just a typical child. They missed the signs. But if you know what to look for, you can see the signs in Hope's story. Her teachers could have questioned why she fell asleep in school and was regularly and unexpectedly pulled out of class by one family member. They could have seen Hope's behavior shift drastically or appear panicked when she re-entered the room. Her neighbors could have asked for a well-child visit when night after night she was sneaking out of her home and found swinging in the dark, refusing to go back. Her pediatrician could have noticed her dissociate in his office and saw that she was fearful of being touched. Dissociation is a mild detachment from immediate surroundings and can often cause an individual to forget entire experiences. It's a way for one to disconnect from your body and the world around you, to help separate yourself from a traumatic event. Her friend's mom could have noticed her lack of emotional responses to situations that would normally invoke a response, or her emotional swings from overly affectionate to completely withdrawn. Hope's babysitter could have pulled up the sleeves to reveal the bruising in multiple stages, the cutting, or the untreated wounds by simply uncovering Hope's long sleeves. 40% of sex trafficking victims are trafficked by a family member. They still go to school, they still go to church, they intersect our daily lives. And sadly, sex trafficking hides in plain sight. So we have to be on watch to protect the youngest children in our community from what happens behind the closed doors of their own home.
Okay, so. Okay. Good. Is it good? And there's one button, I can press that. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this before I? Okay, so, oh, sorry, you can continue. You can go back. We're going to watch a few of those videos. Yeah, so this one specifically, I think it sheds a light on when you talk through all those like signs at the end. None of those were illegal things. None of those were like immediately pressing where you need to call the police, right? But all of those together resulted in something where you could have seen something. You could have called CPS, you could have called the trafficking hotline to ask additional questions, or you could have met with the family. This is one of them. We actually have an educator portal specifically for individuals who work at schools or even parents who have school-aged children, where we have specific modules that highlight things that parents and teachers can look for, and this is one that we always highlight. Additionally, Hope, she was trafficked from 6 to 11, and then she ended up being trafficked later in life as well. Something that's important to know is about 90% of individuals, if they aren't received any sort of healing resources, their likeliness of being re-victimized, of being re-trafficked is very high. And yeah, 90% of them will be trafficked again without that proper care. So luckily, all the survivors that we've worked with in these modules, we've helped receive this care. We've helped them on the recovery process to the point where, you know, they've gone through the judicial process, they've gone through their own healing process, and they've been able to talk about these, but it is still re-traumatizing. We're gonna skip to module 4 right now, and we're gonna do the adult entertainment and escalation. This is one that I feel like very passionate about talking about because we do these surveys every year about OnWatch, and this one is often ranked the least impactful out of any of the trainings, and I think it's because individuals, they see this adult entertainment, they see this individual who, if they choose to do stripping or OnlyFans or anything like that first, they often see them as someone who they chose this life, and they don't necessarily see that as trafficking when it escalates. And that's something that like really radicalized me when I heard that, because unless we can like look at this as a human issue, unless we can look at this as every single trafficking survivor deserves the same equal opportunity for healing, the same process of understanding that what they went through was trafficking, and treating them both like equally as victims and as survivors of this, we're not ever going to solve the problem. So we'll play this and we'll talk after.
You know that show, 16 and Pregnant? Well, that was me. I didn't mean for it to happen. I decided to keep my baby, and my baby daddy split, never to be heard from again. So 9 months later, I was on my own, trying to care for a baby and myself. I got a full-time job, but I could hardly find enough money to buy baby food at the local mini-mart. I was depressed and overwhelmed with constantly having to choose to eat or pay my bills. I didn't want to. No one wants to. sometimes you feel like you have no choice. I started stripping so I could just provide for my baby boy. The club owner took a special interest in me. He even let me bring my son to the club. He would play with my boy so I could work. I hated bringing him there. I never wanted my boy to see me like that. But I didn't have anyone else to call. And I couldn't afford to pay for daycare. The owner promised he'd keep my boy safe. I had no choice but to trust him. Every day when I left for work, I could feel my neighbors watching and judging me. Didn't they realize I had a baby to provide for and my family had kicked me out? Eventually, the club owner told me I owed him a favor. I really didn't think I could say no. After the first time, I told him I couldn't do it again. I wouldn't do it again. He threatened to hurt my son if I didn't. What would you have done? I have no one. It seemed like every day he had more of his friends he wanted me to have sex with. Each time, I got hurt and he got paid. I was doing it to protect my son. I kept my boss from hurting him, and I brought in just enough money to take care of him. But in time, I couldn't handle the pain anymore. To cope, I abused my body. I filled it with drugs. I cut it. I starved it until my clothes hung across bones, critiqued by its own sunken-in eyes. I wanted to disappear. I hated the body that brought me to that place, and I was intent on destroying it. My son would be better off without me. So one day, I decided death was better than this hell I was living. When I woke up in the hospital bed, I was half dead and had no idea how I got there. The nurse looked at me and said, "You were saved for a purpose." I took my son and I got the hell out of that city.
It is not enough to know Tina's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. To the outside world, Tina was a pregnant teen turned stripper who chose that life. The mini-mart cashier noticed a young girl who would come in and out every few days and count the change in her purse to pay for baby food. Her neighbors saw an irresponsible mother who took her child to work. The men who watched her at the club or bought her each night were told she was a prostitute and that she wanted it. They mistook her forced smiles as compliance, but failed to see the club owner watching her across the room. But if you know what to look for, you can see the signs in Tina's story. The reality is, Tina was a teen mother with no support system. Her family had kicked her out and wasn't surprised when she made another bad decision when it came to sex. The mini-mart cashier could have seen someone who spent every dime she had on food for her baby and never on herself. Her neighbors could have noticed a young mother who had no other choice but to bring her baby to work. How was she supposed to pay for her childcare when she couldn't even afford to keep the lights on? Routine clients in the club could have acknowledged the cuts on her arms, her sunken, distant eyes, and how she had become the shell of a human being. Ultimately, Tina escaped her trafficking situation with a suicide attempt, and a nurse who reminded her that she had dignity and worth. Tina was one of the lucky ones. A study from the U.S. National Institutes of Health shows 45% of sex trafficking victims attempt suicide, and many survivors engage in self-harm on a regular basis. Cutting or self-harm is a way of coping with extreme psychological or emotional distress. People who work in the sex entertainment industry can find themselves in situations that often escalate to sex trafficking. Some forms of the sex entertainment industry, like strip clubs, are legal, and it can look like an individual is choosing to be a part of it. Therefore, it can be easy to overlook these illegal activities. These victims will most often intersect with community members in addiction support groups, domestic violence or homeless shelters, and church outreach programs. By being on watch and reporting suspected trafficking, you are helping protect every individual in our communities.
Okay, so you can kind of see why I have a lot of strong thoughts on this one. Something that really hit home for me after I'd spoken about this specific module dozens of times, and then I was working with a nonprofit group on the East Coast, and they were a religious group, and their entire mission was to help create like a support group for women in strip clubs. So they would go and they'd bring them like Christmas gifts, they'd bring them self-care things. They never asked them of anything, never asked them to come to church, never asked them to like quit stripping and get a different job. They simply were there for them. So when they eventually had enough of being trafficked, when they had enough of being exploited, they had a safe place to go. And then they had therapists on staff, they had everything ready. But they were telling me this story of this most recent Christmas Eve when they went. I mean, having to work at a strip club on Christmas Eve is a pretty tragic thing, right? And so they would go and they'd bring these like little Christmas gifts to all the strippers. And they were in the back room, and there was a girl who was just face down on the cement, completely knocked out cold. And so, of course, like the worker, they asked one of these strippers that they had already known, what's wrong with her? And they're like, oh, this happens to every new girl. We give her a bunch of drugs, so she's more like playful and fun on stage, so she can make more tips and so she can make more money. And this is her first day. Her mom dropped her off saying, hey, it's your 18th birthday, you're 18 now, it's time for you to provide for the family. And so when you look at like what the adult entertainment industry can look like, there are a lot of willing participants, but just as equally, there's a lot who they didn't necessarily have that choice. And so often it turns into individuals who can exploit that for more. My dad was a lawyer in Las Vegas, and their law firm, they paid, I think, $1,000 a month to have one flyer in the strip club bathroom because of how many women eventually ended up being trafficked, ended up being raped on their way home. Something like that, where they ended up having to press charges. So there's my big soapbox about it. Any questions about this one in particular? Yes?
Are there any, I mean, obviously it's like, this is like a breeding ground for this kind of legal to illegal activity. Are there like any states, governments that have put in place like programs to like watch like a closer eye, or is that not really a thing?
That's a good question. So the question was like, are there any current law enforcement programs that have really kind of been able to watch this legal to illegal transition and how we can help maybe stop that from happening? We've worked with a handful of different like legislators on getting certain laws passed around primarily survivor crime forgiveness. So if an individual was kind of like forced into prostitution at one point, they can technically be arrested for that. Oftentimes, like, they steal, they do things like that. So certain laws have been implemented in forgiving those if they go through certain recovery programs, but that's not really a prevention tactic like you had asked. Something that is common that we've been working on is simply training law enforcement to call them survivors over very other unchoice words that would have been said instead. But in regards to specific things like that, I can't answer that specifically because I haven't heard of any, unfortunately. Any other questions? All right, so we can go back. And then who here is a parent? All right, that's a lot. We're gonna go to Module 5, which this one actually took place in Utah. It talks a little bit about sextortion. These are all like the true text of what happened. It happened here in a Utah school by a Utah, I don't remember if he was a teacher or just worked for the school, but we'll watch this one and then we'll chat.
How's your day? Good. We have about an hour or so, so we're gonna run some errands. Okay. And then we'll go pick up
Eventually, he convinced me to sneak out on weekends to meet him. He used the news as blackmail to coerce me into sexual acts with his friends. I never thought a single nude would lead me into sex trafficking.
It's not enough to know Hillary's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. To Hillary, she was a teenage girl in a thrilling relationship with an older guy who she wanted to please. She believed it was a relationship with love, protection, and commitment. She knew her parents would get mad if they knew she was sending pictures. She had no idea he was distributing the photos over pornographic websites. She just wanted to keep him happy, hold his attention. To her parents, Hillary was a girl who started dressing provocatively. But that's what teenagers do. She was always messaging friends, making social media videos, and spending hours in her room. Everywhere she went, her phone was with her, and she wouldn't let them near it. When she couldn't find her phone or her phone would die, she would panic. In reality, Hillary was groomed by a predator. Grooming is the process of someone building a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with an individual so they can manipulate, exploit, and abuse them for a sexual offense. Sexting has become one of a significant part of the kids' online world. 1 in 5 teens report they engage in sexting. Ultimately, engaging in sexting can lead to sextortion, child pornography, or blackmail. Sextortion is when someone demands sexual images by threatening to release or distribute material the child seeks to keep private. Alternatively, child pornography occurs when a child provides sexual images to someone else. They have no control over whether someone else redistributes those images. Once images are being sold online, it's difficult to track and remove. Those images can damage the child's reputation. Furthermore, legal action can be taken against both the child and the predator for creation and distribution of child pornography. While a child coerced into sending sexual images is a victim, legal ramifications still exist. And it's important to discuss those with your child as a preventative measure. And finally, there's blackmail. A child can be forced to engage in sex acts and illegal or harmful activities to keep the sexually explicit images private. Periodically, traffickers will provide a teen with 2 phones once the exploitation has escalated to the creation of child pornography or in-person trafficking. Of those children who engage in sexting, 2 out of 3 will experience sextortion before the age of 16. Escalation of sextortion usually occurs within the first 2 weeks of initial contact with the predator, and then threats ensue daily.
Okay, that one's always a little bit heavy. And something that I feel like is one of the most common questions that I tend to get about it is the legal ramifications for a child. Did anyone catch that? Essentially, a child can get in trouble for if she provides them to an adult sells them on or puts them on pornographic websites. The child can still, in most states, get in trouble for that. Completely messed up, completely wrong, completely against it, but that's like nature of where we're currently at in our country, and just with laws being really slow to change. Are there any specific questions about some of the things that were talked about in that one? Yes?
I'm curious if you've noticed a difference since things like the Gab phone have come out, or if that's actual helpful, or like what impact has that had on stuff like this?
That's a good question. Okay, that's a good question, wondering if things like the Gab phone and stuff like that have made a difference in this. The interesting part about raising awareness of this problem, like for example, Gab, we've seen billboards of, 500,000 predators online every day. The more that the awareness is raised, the more that we actually see these issues come to light. And so we haven't noticed like any sort of downhill trends right now, because individuals are still like harnessing different apps and still taking advantage of all of the opportunities at such a higher pace than things like Gab are making a difference in. However, I truly think Gab is an amazing resource. Another one that we developed in tandem with a mental health wellness company is Raise. It's an app for parents on just having conversations with your child about technology and helping them to understand that. There's also Cyberdive is another one that we've worked closely with. They have like a phone for kids where it's a smartphone. You can help monitor that, and it raises flags on keywords, or if a 35-year-old man starts following your 11-year-old kid, things like that. But it still allows your child to maybe understand and have social media as a teenager, so they don't just turn 18 and never have had those conversations. So there are a lot of good resources out there. In regards to trends, unfortunately not yet, because people are still taking more and more advantage of the internet. Yes?
I think as parents, we're really excited to share pictures of our kids and experiences and stuff. Have you seen that related to any of this, as far as like people seeking parents and grabbing those types of photos, or is it, like, where does that line drawn? I don't know.
Yeah. That's a good question. So just kind of that line between like posting photos of your kids and then that line between where it maybe could be problematic. I don't personally have an opinion on it because I don't have kids. I have spoken with several people, Elizabeth being one of them. Elizabeth, she has 3 kids. I think a lot of people, that's one of the top questions that she gets asked because she was kidnapped as a child, of why do you feel comfortable posting your children online? And she's talked with a lot of people about it, and she's essentially said, like, your kids are going to be online at some point. If it's not you, it's your friends or your kids' friends' mom who's going to post a picture of them. And she's kind of decided, like, I'm going to continue posting pictures of my children because I've had those conversations with them about social media. I've had these conversations. They don't have phones yet. I feel like it's still that safe place. I don't feel like I can answer that super well because I don't have a ton of experience, and I haven't seen one way or the other. I have noticed it's a pretty hot topic where people are not posting pictures of their kids currently, but yeah, I don't know. I think social media is an interesting place where anyone will take an opportunity, but sometimes, I mean, there's only so far you can go in protecting, right? Of finding that line between helping them feel included and loved and valued and having those conversations, and then still letting them feel safe. And yeah. Any other questions? Okay, we're gonna watch boyfriending. This is the other most common form of sex trafficking, and it really shows like what this grooming process looks like.
My parents died from a drug overdose when I was 7. On my 8th birthday, I went into the foster care system. The sexual abuse from my foster brother began immediately, but no one believed me. For years, I bounced from foster family to foster family. No matter where I went, the abuse would follow, either at the hands of those in charge of protecting me or another kid living in the home. To escape my reality, I would spend hours on my phone, video chatting with random strangers in my room. No one asked me about it. They assumed I was chatting with friends from school. When I was 15 years old, I met the one. I told him all the things my dad had done to me. I told him my fears, my hopes, my dreams. He asked if we could meet in person, and he took me to this fancy new restaurant in town. That night, he told me that he would keep me safe. He made me feel something I had never felt before, loved. For 6 months, he loved me, bought me new clothes and a new iPhone. He took care of me, protected me. But then something changed. Eventually, my boyfriend suggested that I start sleeping with some of his friends so we could afford the future we had dreamed of. The first time, I obliged, but after I felt dirty. He
he held me that night as I cried and gave me something to ease the pain. That night, I went back to my foster home. I refused to talk much. My foster parents thought I was giving them an attitude. They didn't know what had happened. The next day, there were 2 guys at his apartment. I said no, and he hit me. He said I was going back in our agreement. When it was done, he held me as I cried. Then he said he wanted to buy me something. He took me shopping and told me he loved me. He helped me use makeup to cover up the bruise on my cheek. He talked about our future. He said this was only temporary. And so this pattern continued. I was bathed in his love and abuse, threats and rewards. Each day I went to him, I just wanted to make him happy. But I didn't know if he would love me or hurt me that day. But his love was still better than any love I had ever had. So eventually I quit school and left my foster family to be with him.
It is not enough to know Ava's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. To the outside world, Ava was the sad story who had lost both parents to drugs. She was a hard case for anyone who tried to engage her. She was a bit of a loner, but she didn't seem to care because she had an older boyfriend who ruled her world. To some people, Ava was the girl who quit school and ran away. But if you know what to look for, you can see the signs in Ava's story. The reality is Ava was a vulnerable child who was groomed to be trafficked through a boyfriending scenario, which went unnoticed because Ava bounced between foster care families with no support system or consistency of schools or friends. During the grooming situation, her foster parents could have questioned her intense romance with an older boy. Her teachers could have recognized her hypersexualized behavior or provocative clothes. Other students could have noticed how she would parade her latest expensive gift from her older boyfriend. Anyone could have seen how a girl already lacking a support system or many friends was drawn into a very isolated relationship. Once the trafficking began, her foster parents could have noticed her mood drastically shift. Her foster siblings could have acknowledged her jumpy and anxious behavior. Her teachers could have recognized multiple stages of bruising. Other students could have seen a girl who was flaunting a relationship with an older man and being secretive about that same relationship. Boyfriending is one of the most common forms of sex trafficking. It is a grooming process by which an individual, usually a woman, enters a romantic relationship with a man. It escalates from a mutual caring for one another to the man controlling and manipulating the woman. Everyone needs to be on watch for unhealthy relationships that can escalate to a trafficking situation.
Okay, so 2 things I want to bring up really quickly. In the beginning, we talked about how there are some groups that are more vulnerable to trafficking than others. One of those is individuals in foster care or who have been in foster care. Based on what research, somewhere between 80 and 90% of trafficking survivors have touched the foster care system at one point. That's something that kind of enrages me a little because I'm like, if we were to fix trafficking, like if we were to fix foster care, we could probably fix most of trafficking. And if we just were to invest in these children and ensure that they were safe, either by their foster care parents, by their previous parents, or by, we see runaways really often. And like we mentioned, 1 in 6 of those most likely went into sex trafficking. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is even though this whole training is really focused on sex trafficking, so many of the maybe signs that you can look out for they intersect so many different forms of sexual violence, and I think this one really shows a good job of looking at what domestic violence looks like. You're really kind of trained into not necessarily seeing all of these red flags, and because somebody loves you so much, you kind of forgive the bad things about them. We work with a domestic violence shelter up in Logan really closely. It's always full. Cache Valley is one of the safest places that, like, it always ranks in one of the top safest college towns, things like that. And yet, domestic violence shelter, it's always full. There's always women and children there. And it's one of those things where an individual oftentimes doesn't know how bad it is until somebody points out, I guess, how hot the water is. If we're using the frog analogy of if you throw a frog in boiling water versus if you put a frog in water and then you boil it, the frog will literally kill himself, not realizing it's getting hotter and hotter. And it's oftentimes a police officer coming and maybe pointing out, hey, there's a dangerous situation. If domestic violence was called and they chose not to press charges, or if you guys see like friends or family who maybe have one of those dangerous relationships, whether it feels like an emotional hold, a financial hold, or a physical hold, sometimes even just having a conversation with them can point out if the water's hot. Are there any questions about this one? Okay. So we're actually gonna skip up to module 3 now. I do this kind of backwards because I want you to know about boyfriending before we watch this one that talks about young boys with boyfriending as well.
I hate talking about this. I'm not supposed to. It makes me upset. But boys don't cry. See, I wasn't the popular kid. I wasn't the smart kid. I was the awkward kid. I was bullied. At first, they just made jokes and said mean things, but eventually, it turned to getting beat up regularly after school because they said I was gay. Over time, I trained myself to stop crying. Boys don't cry. It made the beatings worse when I cried, too. I condensed the pain and hid in the depths of my being. Gaming was my escape. The people that I met there were my friends. They understood me, they wanted to protect me, and I wasn't weird to them. My mom tried to talk to me about the bruises, but I shut her out. I shut everything out. I would sit on the couch for hours gaming, getting lost in a world that wasn't this one. When I met the man who would eventually traffic me, I felt safe. He laughed at my jokes. He just got me. He was mad at what was happening to me. I felt like he was my way out. After a year of bullying, he said enough. He offered to protect me more than my mom could. He said I needed a man of the house. He said I could come live with him. I didn't have to go back to my school. I could work for him. I never even asked what I would be doing. I just packed my bags and left home. My mom and I had been fighting, so I told myself she wouldn't miss me. The day I got to his house, it was the best. He had a brand new gaming system for me, with the latest release of the game we met on. He let me try booze for the first time. We ordered Chinese food. And finally, no one had anything bad to say about me, and I knew no one would ever beat me up again. On the second day, the man who stayed with me was gone. He was completely changed. He sold me to his friend, then another, and another. The next 4 years, I lived in a nightmare that I still cannot put into words. I'm fine. I will be fine. Okay, I'm not fine. But boys don't cry, so I have to be fine.
It's not enough to know Joey's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. There are also behaviors or situations that we can address that make a child vulnerable to traffickers. To the outside world, Joey was an awkward kid who was bullied at school, but people told themselves it wasn't their business, so they didn't get involved. No kids wanted to hang out with him or risk getting beat up for befriending him. His mom always justified it by saying he was different and suffered from the lack of a father figure, but didn't have the support system to ask for help. His mom and teachers noticed he seemed happier when he played video games, so they let him do it, without ever talking to him about the dangers of the online world. Joey said that's when he met people who got him, and everyone was just excited that Joey finally had friends. even if they had never spoken with any of them. Over time, his friends online were the only people he would talk to. He became more isolated. His grades got worse. He hated school. Then one day, he was gone. In reality, Joey was a bullied youth who needed someone to step in and protect him. A boy who needed a male role model in his life to fill the void his father left. Here are the signs someone could have seen prior to Joey running away to meet the man who would become his trafficker. A mom who worked 2 jobs just trying to make ends meet. She was unable to be at school functions or get Joey involved in extracurricular activities that required someone to drive him there. Joey lived in a financially unstable home and felt isolated. He spent hours by himself as his mom worked. Joey's teacher and school counselor noticed that he craved connection. He just wanted to be seen and accepted. His mom accepted that his escape was the gaming console or his phone, where he would spend an excessive amount of time with his friends in the digital space. Joey's trafficking situation would have been nearly impossible to notice once it started, since he did not leave the house of his trafficker until he escaped. Oftentimes, preventing trafficking within our community means protecting vulnerable youth before they run away or are lured by a trafficker. For vulnerable children like Joey, you may have had an opportunity to engage them at the first signs of abuse, neglect, and isolation. 35% of children in trafficking cases now involve boys, which means this could impact any of us. We all need to be on watch to identify and support vulnerable youth in our communities, because we have an opportunity to stop trafficking before it starts.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys heard that stat, 35% of trafficking involves boys, but boys often are more underreported, and so we actually don't know how close that maybe could be to 50-50. And then in regards to child sex abuse, national rates, it's about 50-50 until 12 years old, in which case girls go higher, boys go slightly lower, where it's about 2 out of 3 are girls. I also don't know if you guys heard, he actually has maybe more of a traditional to what people think of when they think of sex trafficking, where he actually was taken from his home, even though he went willingly, but he did not leave his trafficker's apartment for 4 years. He was kept in that apartment, being sex trafficked day after day for 4 years. And so while that's not typical, it still happens here in the United States. It still happens often. I know we've talked about this, but there was a woman rescued, it's now been a year and a half, in Logan, 26 years, held in the same house. She was brought as, I think she was like 17, and she was held there being trafficked for 26 years. So it still happens here in the United States, it still happens here in Utah. Are there any questions about this one? Cool, okay. Something I will say is we've talked a little bit about like sexting and what sextortion looks like. We've talked about internet grooming. There are so many different apps and so many different things that predators are really using to take advantage of kids who are just looking for that connection. Like we saw that in the sextortion one, we saw that in the boyfriending one, and we saw that in this one. One day I hope that you meet someone who we work with. His name's Jason Weiss, and he is an undercover detective who poses online as an almost 15-year-old girl. So every day he'll post a picture. He has this woman who helps. She's 20, but she looks 14, 15, like she's very young. And he posts a picture of her on apps. She's just like bored. Parents are gone. What's up? Within minutes. He actually does this as a live presentation. Even he's done it, we did it in Sundance last year. He does it as a live presentation where he'll show his phone and he'll post this picture. And within minutes, dozens of men are reaching out. He'll say, I'm almost 15, so he'll say, I'm a minor. They'll often say their age. They're often in their 30s. And usually I think like he tries to see how fast he can get a dick pic to get sent. And I've seen a lot of them. They get sent almost immediately. For every child that's looking for connection, there are so many creepy people who are looking to take advantage of that. Okay, we're going to skip down further, sorry. We're actually going to watch Julie's story now, which is Module 11. This really talks through child sex abuse, domestic violence, and trafficking, and what those three really look like and how often an individual is re-victimized. I can't tell you how often we hear trafficking situations where they were first abused as children, domestic violence situations that turned into trafficking, all of those different things. So we're gonna watch this and then we'll chat after.
I was sexually abused as a child, and this destroyed my sense of boundaries and personal worth. I felt like I was the property of a man to be used solely for his pleasure. I was burdened with this secret and was looking for someone to rescue me. My rescuer came in the form of a boyfriend. We eventually married and had 3 children, but he was far from a rescuer. Instead, my husband proved to be emotionally, sexually, and physically abusive. I was conditioned to take his abuse and keep his secrets, and found myself, once again, hoping for a hero. I never told anyone what was happening, so when the pain became unbearable, I tried to take my own life. The day my husband was arrested for domestic violence, the dad of one of my preschool students started offering friendship and support in my time of need. This man was kind and supportive, helped me navigate the legal system, and made sure my kids and I had everything we needed. 2 weeks later, he raped me, and his personality changed completely. He became possessive and controlling and threatened violence to my family and me if I told anyone or tried to get away. This man was a truck driver and used his job as a means to traffic me. He took me on trips where he would deliver me into the hands of other men who raped me while he collected the cash. My trafficker took photographs and videos of the abuse and threatened to distribute them to my ex-husband and others to tarnish my reputation. These photos and videos held me hostage. While on these trips, I was seen at truck stops, restaurants, and motels by attendants and customers, but they assumed I was a willing participant. I was often drugged to make me more compliant, and I was too afraid to say anything or ask for help because of the threats of violence against my loved ones and me.
Cash. Cash.
Take him outside.
Go outside. Wait outside.
I have a problem, Marlon.
No problem.
One night, while traveling down a snowy winter road,
Nervous? Here, take these. Oh, you're too good for these now? Don't need the help?
this isn't fair.
Jesus. Don't. Why do you do this? Why do you make me have to be like this?
I'm not making you do anything!
Yes, you are! This is your fault! Take the pills. Take them! Hey, take them!
I jumped from the moving truck to escape my trafficker. A car traveling in the opposite direction slowed down, but the driver did not intervene as they watched me being dragged by my hair back to the truck. In between these trips, I came home and tried to act normal. I took care of my children, helped out in their classrooms, and volunteered with the PTA. watch my children as I went on these mysterious trips with a man they'd never met. As the abuse continued, my trafficker teamed up with my ex-husband to further intimidate me and frustrate the child custody battle. One day, my trafficker forced me to meet with his boss to get financing for his truck. He thought that since I was a woman, I would have a better chance of his boss saying yes. But an amazing thing happened. His employer saw me. I mean, he truly saw me. He questioned what was happening, and when things didn't add up, he offered to help me, and I was ultimately able to escape my trafficker. I couldn't have done it on my own. I needed help. Because of one person's willingness to step into my story, I was able to regain my freedom and rebuild my life.
It's not enough to know Julie's story. We have to take a step beyond awareness to understand how to identify trafficked individuals and feel equipped to report suspected trafficking. To the outside world, Julie was mom, preschool teacher, and part of the PTA. Her family and friends knew her as quiet, reserved, and someone who didn't share about her personal life. As the abuse from her husband escalated, Julie's depression worsened. When the secrets became too much to carry, she tried to commit suicide. Julie's trafficker took advantage of her at a very vulnerable time. Her husband had been arrested, and she was searching for someone to protect her from the people who previously abused her. As Julie was trafficked around the country on long weekend trips, she consistently came in contact with people at truck stops, motels, and restaurants. The truck stop attendants wrote her off as a willing participant and told her that her kind wasn't welcome in their establishment. The motel employees just accepted the request for an hourly room paid with cash. The staff didn't want to get involved with someone who was obviously on drugs. The car driver was probably terrified to get involved in a violent situation. Julie's neighbors and family saw her return from these weekends exhausted, still dissociated from the drugs, but believed it to be a fun weekend away. But if you know what to look for, you can see the signs of trafficking in Julie's story. Her family and neighbors could have asked to meet this mysterious man who always wanted Julie's attention and questioned her need to go away with him every weekend. The truck stop attendants could have asked Julie if she was safe and allowed her to use their restroom rather than seeing her as someone who was willingly servicing people. The motel employees could have counted the number of men meeting her trafficker in the lobby and being escorted to a room. They could have questioned the hourly rooms paid with cash or the request for extra towels and sheets. The restaurant staff could have seen the distant and detached look in Julie's eyes and observed the way her boyfriend was possessive and controlling. They could have noticed Julie's clothes were inappropriate for the weather and that she was dressed to look younger. The car driver who saw Julie on the road could have called 911 immediately, noted the truck's license plate number, and reported the incident without ever having to be in harm's way. Julie's family could have suspected that the relationship with her trafficker was questionable, or noticed how the custody battle and this unhealthy relationship was affecting her mental health. Ultimately, Julie was saved by a man who saw her. He didn't know that Julie feared for her children's lives, that videos had been filmed to blackmail her. He didn't know the full story, but he saw the pain and fear in her eyes and took action by simply asking if she was okay. Oftentimes, early childhood sexual abuse can lead to a cycle of victimization. This means victims can find themselves in abusive relationships of varying magnitude, some of which escalate to trafficking. When someone experiences early childhood trauma, they are more prone to depressive episodes later in life, more likely to develop PTSD, and groomed to normalize and accept abusive behavior or unhealthy relationships. Once someone finds themselves cycling through abusive relationships, they often need someone else to help them recognize the abusive pattern or help them see a way out. For Julie, one person's courage to speak out is why she is safe today and advocating for herself and other survivors.
Julie's video is often the heaviest, and so I try and save that as the last survivor-based video that we watch. Her story, it is very raw and it's very real, and something that we've talked about before with her situation is that I know a few of you guys have read her book, right? Of just kind of how her story, it doesn't make her out to be this like angelic person. She talks about how, you know, she did risk losing custody of her kids because she was suicidal, that she did have this man who she, you know, offered to have help, even though maybe she didn't know everything about him. And all of these things are things that you see so often in re-victimization. Something that is really cool about her story, though, is that man who rescued her, Barry. His entire company now, I mean, he owns a trucking company. They are all OnWatch certified. He actually donates $50 to the foundation for every single person who becomes OnWatch certified. They have one of their long-haul trucks that's wrapped in OnWatch. They have a family barbecue every year that even has like an OnWatch brand for their burgers. Like, they've really invested in changing this culture of, you know, we talk about how often individuals who are being trafficked are often seen at truck stops, and they really are trying to change that culture and make their company at least be seen as this like safe place and as this place that doesn't tolerate this. And that's why I love doing all of these like company trainings, is because that's what you guys are doing here. You guys are really looking at this issue and you're choosing to address it, even though it's not directly related to what you guys do. It has the ability to make so much of a difference, especially in sales and especially with what you guys do. So thank you guys. We're gonna watch one more video. It is module 9? 8. And this just has, if you guys want to pull out your phones, it has like the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I always ask that you guys save that number. Yes?
I have a question really quick.
Yeah.
So I'm from Bountiful. So Julie's story like hits home with me like really hard. And I know Tyler's from Bountiful, you know, we're all from that area. And I think that like, I had the opportunity to sit down with you and Elizabeth in, like when we were offsite for like an hour and a half, it was raining, and it changed my life. I think that like, the majority of the people we're talking to are males that have probably fucked up at some point. Like they've done something, whether it be through friends, family, or whatever else, where they're like, this is cool, this is where this is at. I do believe that we can all change and we can all like adapt and like we learn as we go on, right? We're not the same person we were 10 years ago. When you're like speaking to, I don't know if this is the right part, I kind of feel like it is, but when you're speaking to like an organization that's dominantly filled of males that have messed up at some point, what would be your advice to them to say, whether you've messed up, whether you've not, like what steps would you take to like recognize that like this is a problem, and that like regardless of if you've been a part of this or if you haven't been a part of this, how can we help that change? Like, because to me, like sitting down with you guys, like seeing dishes from Bountiful, I think the Bountiful is like the safest place in the world, and it's not. It's not, right? Like it's just as bad as these other places. We've just built this facade around it that creates this, that it's perfect, and it's not. So what would your advice
Yeah. So I guess like as a real quick recap, one, yeah, you being from Bountiful, this does take place. Julie is from northern Utah. That is where this happened. And all of those trips, they happened in Utah and they happened outside of Utah. But to further address maybe your question of how can we address like rooms of men who, you know, predominantly men in companies, especially like what I just mentioned, a trucking company, of people who have maybe fucked up in the past and who have like maybe had things that they hold on to as that form of even like guilt or shame around this cause, and how can we maybe look past that and address just the issue here today. And I personally feel like the more educated we become, it's okay to change our mind on things, and the more we have that ability to be kind of like that incubator on continuing change. I think all of us have that, and when you look at everybody has experienced trauma in some way, and whether you were on one side or the other, I think every person, they've seen a nude picture sent at some point in their lives, right? They've seen some piece of like pornography. I think the average age that someone first sees pornography is under 8. I think it's like 6 years old now. Every single person has experienced that. I remember I was 14 and I was dating a 19-year-old. I was 18 and I was dating a 29-year-old. Like, we all have had these big problems that I look back and I'm like, what the hell, Sage? Like, what were you doing? But I think if we choose to like look forward and look that this is a human issue, this is an issue that there are people right now who are suffering. And OnWatch, it's a long-term prevention problem, but it's also a right now prevention problem. And there's a lot of things that we can do to really instigate change. And being okay to talk about this stuff, no matter what is in the past, I think is that first step, and being willing to change. Like, I remember how healing it was for me when I first like apologized about something that I changed my mind on, and then I spoke about it, right? Like, you're allowed to change your mind, you're allowed to be open. I think that I've seen a lot of donors who, I don't know, I work at golf tournaments a lot. There are people who are supporting like sexual abuse causes and then inappropriately hit on the drink cart girl right in front of you while blasting music about strippers, right? Like, it's all around us, and as long as we're willing to listen, I think that's the first step. But yeah, are there any other questions?
There was one online that kind of, I think, interesting how you ended that last part, but he said, we addressed a number of questionable organizations out there raising tens of millions of dollars while claiming to be helping reduce sex trafficking, like OUR.
I was gonna say, I think you didn't have to put that last part in there, and I know who you're talking about. Yeah, I personally will just say that like our mission with OnWatch and our mission with our foundation is to raise awareness about what domestic sex trafficking looks like, and not try and paint it out to be this picture of innocent children being taken away in shipping containers, but rather kind of that true reality of what it looks like, of talking about there are people in the adult entertainment industry, there are people who chose certain things before they got trafficked, and we're trying to raise awareness about that and how we can make a difference here. In regards to specific organizations like OUR, everything is pretty public. If you were to Google certain things, their federal investigation right now is pretty public. And so just understanding to like read sources beforehand. Additionally, even things like Sound of Freedom, great movie, really inspiring, really like tearjerker, right? But read OUR's blog about it. It said, based on a true story, except for the parts that aren't. That's their blog title. And it talks about everything that's not true about it. And one of the things it addresses is, this is not what trafficking looks like. The shipping containers, that was a Hollywood choice. Things like that, just know what you're doing before you choose to like give into that. Do a quick Google search, read about the organization, but in general, my thought is if we can make a difference on it, if we can have people talking about sex trafficking openly after they've for so many years kind of just like shied away from it, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with us talking about it and us raising awareness, not funds, raising awareness about this issue and how we can make a difference with it. So that's a good question. Any other questions? All right, we can do more questions right after this, but I did want to just point out like one quick thing too is we're gonna talk through all of the signs to look out for with trafficking. And one of those is, for example, like provocative clothing. But if you watched in Julie's module where they talked about inappropriately dressed for the weather, or if you looked at the sexting to sextortion one, her boyfriend was providing clothes for her to wear. And so often like these initial judgments can be made, or it can be this side of like, that doesn't mean it, but also just be aware that those signs, like, they could mean something further as well, but none of them are necessarily descriptive in and of itself, but it's helpful to understand the whole picture. Also, real quick, I do want to talk about the National Human Trafficking Hotline. This hotline is great because it's one of those where they know the questions to ask. They know how to understand a possible trafficking situation more than maybe your typical 911 operator. And so they can help ask all of those questions to gather a case to then send it to your local law enforcement. If it's something that you see immediately, call 911, but also call them because they can help provide additional information. So we'll watch this and then we'll talk right after.
The majority of survivors of sex trafficking are not going to self-identify. While there are many reasons that they won't ask for help, one of the most common is trauma bonding with their trafficker. Another common reason is when they've asked for help in the past, no one believed them. Neither of these should change our response to suspected trafficking. As you've seen throughout the training, trafficking presents itself in many different ways, and we all need to be on watch to help eradicate sex trafficking. First and foremost, do not talk to, approach, or engage a suspected trafficker. This could present significant risk of severe beatings or even death for the victims being trafficked. It could also put you in danger if the trafficker feels you're a threat to their business. You may encounter a suspected trafficking situation or an active trafficking situation. Both are important to report. Anytime you encounter a situation where you suspect sex trafficking, you should report a tip to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which can be done by calling 1-888-373-7888 or texting help or info to be free. If you witness an active trafficking situation, you should immediately call law enforcement. An active situation is where you can provide actionable information to law enforcement, like witnessing child abuse in conjunction with other indicators of sex trafficking, as previously reviewed throughout the training. When you see the signs and report sex trafficking, it requires law enforcement to do their job more effectively by identifying trafficking patterns, documenting suspicious activity, which ultimately leads to increased victim identification. Here it is again. If someone needs help, immediately call 911. For a suspected trafficking situation, report a tip to the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888 or text help to be free. Next, let's review 10 common signs and indicators. 1. An individual who disassociates or seems to be disconnected from the world around them. 2. Mental health disorders like PTSD. 3. Drug or alcohol dependence. 4. Hypersexualized behavior or dress that's inappropriate for that time of year. 5. reaction to people or experiences. 7, tattoo or branding that stands out. 8, physical abuse. 9, unhealthy relationship with apparent abuse. 10, a shift in behavior and isolating themselves from former relationships. Ultimately, you're never going to be at fault for reporting a trafficking situation, regardless of the outcome. But you will always wonder about that individual if you don't make the call. Like the Attorney General of Utah, Sean Reyes, said, we would rather go through 10 cases and have all 10 of them not turn out to be human trafficking than miss one case.
Okay, thanks for like choosing to listen to all this. This is all really heavy, but these are also survivors who they've gone through years of healing. Julie, her and her second husband, her current husband, they adopted a baby, and she was in treatment for the first 18 months of her life. Healing is heavy. Additionally, she's been doing telehealth 5 to 7 days a week for the past 7 years. And she's still like not through all of that trauma. There's a Harvard therapist who's telling her, you know, like about how much there is to unpack. This is like really heavy, but these are all survivors who not only have they gone through that healing process, but they also have chosen to kind of almost re-traumatize themselves. They've chosen to put themselves in a vulnerable state to tell their stories, so we can help raise awareness about what trafficking looks like in so many different ways. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I know it's heavy. Do you guys have any last questions? Yes.
I have a question, obviously. So.
You don't just want to say thanks or good job? You have a question? Okay.
So obviously, this is like super heavy for all of us, right? As far as that goes, and I think that last stat by Sean Reyes that it was like 10 out of 10, even if it's 10 out of 10 that are not, we just want to find the one. What advice would you give to us that like whether it be like somebody like that came from like a victim situation or knows about a victim situation that comes to you with confidence or whatnot? A, how to receive that from somebody, and then B, what do you do once you have that information of like, hey, this situation isn't good, like this situation isn't something you should probably be a part of. What advice would you give to us as far as those go?
Yeah, so just to like ensure for online, how to respond if somebody tells you about their situation that doesn't necessarily seem safe or healthy, and just maybe how you can be a resource for them. So I guess it depends on how bluntly they say things. For example, Elizabeth, like when she started the We Believe You campaign, it's because she has had hundreds and thousands of people. She says, you know, handful of people every time she's spoken, thousands of times, come up to her after. And actually, every time I do one of these OnWatch presentations, I've almost always had a handful of people come up to me after and say, this happened to me. I was sexually abused as a child. I was trafficked. My daughter-in-law was trafficked. I was in a domestic violence situation. That happens a lot, and the more that you speak about this, the more you can expect for people to maybe see you as a safe person where they can talk about some of those things. If it's really direct, Elizabeth says it best, where it's like, I believe you, I support you, and I love you. Now, how can I help you? Where it's really just that open side of, do you want to talk about it? Do you not? I had a really close family member who it was literally probably a week or two after Elizabeth and I launched like the public We Believe You campaign, and she called me saying that she was raped the night before in Salt Lake. She had it recorded. Saying like, I don't want this, please stop. And she was trying to decide if she wanted to report it to the police or not. And so I was literally just that listening ear. I didn't feel like it was my place to give advice on what she should do. I gave her, maybe pros and cons, and I really just listened. Be that safe place for them first. Something that Elizabeth has talked about is she's had the luxury of being believed, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people, they've had something happen to them where they maybe fell a little bit at fault. Maybe they led them on a little bit too much. Maybe they said yes the first time. Maybe it's a husband or a boyfriend who they've gone too far, but like it's also consensual, so they're not really sure. They've had that luxury of being believed, and so don't question them. Be that safe place first. Elizabeth talked about this one time in church where somebody put their foot against the door when she was in the bathroom, and they said you wanted this, you put an innocent man in prison because you loved him, and they essentially just accused her of that. Don't do that. Don't ask questions. Don't ask why don't you leave? Don't ask, hey, do you need this? Ask how I can support you. Ask what I can do for you. Talk with them. Check in on them regularly. And when they feel comfortable enough to maybe ask for maybe your opinion on things, that's when you can talk about therapy. That's when you can talk about support groups. That's when you can talk about, hey, I had this nonprofit come in and talk. What would you think if I even just recommended you to have a conversation with them? Just send a little text message with me on it. I'm happy to do that. Or just something like that. But I think the most important thing first is just be a safe place. Yes?
I'm just wondering, thinking of practical takeaways, because I think a lot of part of the benefit of this partnership is that we're in a lot of random strangers' homes, and we see random things, and we're not close to people, nor are we going to be close to them to have those kind of conversations. But you pick up on weird vibes. My old job before this, I was in a lot of hotels, and you also pick up on weird stuff where people kind of knew there was some form of prostitution going on, but it was kind of hush hush, kind of weird. But it's also in upstanding hotels where it was so I'm trying to figure out our role in these where we're not close to the people, and what would be the appropriate action steps. If we go to a close in a stranger's house, we pick up on there's some weird vibes going on, but you can't really call the cops on them, and I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what's those steps and those where we're not close with them.
That's a great question. So where Garrett's question was a little more if I know someone who's close to me, there's more if I know someone who I meet and I may not see them again, or if I see them for 5 minutes and something seems weird, what do I do? That's one of those things where if it seems weird enough, if there's 2 or 3 signs that something seems weird, do a non-emergency police department call, because what they do is they won't go and arrest someone. They won't do that. However, if 2 people do that, or if 3 people do that, or if you see a family, you call and say, hey, their 9-year-old son, he had bruises, he was really disassociated, and he wasn't allowed to talk to me when his other siblings were. I just want to report this as a non-emergency call, here's the address. Their teachers are also required to make any sort of reporting on anything that seems like child abuse. And so if there are then 2 situations, that means that the police will take it seriously. That means that it will be investigated on, and it means that you don't have to kind of have that guilt of should I have done something. I've talked a little bit about my little brother who used to install solar panels, and he had just the weirdest situation. And I was able to convince him to at least just call and report it, but it was a woman who wasn't allowed to leave the house. She wasn't allowed to talk with him. She had no knowledge of the area, and she looked very malnourished. And it was just one of those situations that he got crazy weird vibes, and it didn't help that he had this really tall fence with barbed wire around his whole property. The whole thing was kind of weird. And so I think in those situations, just even calling, or even just calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline and saying, hey, here are things that I've observed, and then they can take it from there. They can decide whether or not to give it to local law enforcement, but at least it's out of your hands and you don't have that kind of on your conscience.
I like the example too of the lady getting her hair pulled in the street. That's call directly 911.
Yes.
Try and stay with them as long as possible and drive off.
Yes, definitely, and try and like observe as many things as you can. They always say don't like address them, but like observe things. Like, hey, this is what she was wearing. This is what he was wearing. This is what I noticed he was doing. This is the license plate. This is the truck. All of those things. Yes.
Just real quick, I mean, obviously we hope to distribute this training to new reps coming on for years to come. What would you say to a new rep who doesn't know necessarily about the partnership, or they may think that like, oh, I can pick up on vibes. I don't need to know the signs to watch for. Like, what would you say to someone who, obviously cares about it, but may not think that the training is that important?
That's a good question. So just kind of like what the importance of the training, I guess, and the importance of the partnership. So Malou Foundation and Elizabeth Smart Foundation, like the whole reason why we do what we do and why we get the opportunity to work with you guys is to really help raise awareness in communities on what this looks like. And I guess the first thing I'll say is if there is a survivor of trafficking who's currently out there and they can't even tell you themselves that they are currently being trafficked, how can an individual expect to know just based on like gut feelings and maybe just like looking out for things insanely obvious, like a giant bruise on your face that could recognize domestic violence. I have probably watched this training like 300 times maybe, and I actually feel like I continue to learn from it, and I continue to have things that maybe resonate in my mind a little bit more. When you look at each of those individual signs, I said this in the beginning, but none of these things are like illegal things. None of these things are like blaring in your face. It's a kid kidnapped in the basement, chained up. Like, that's so rare. And so the importance of understanding all these like little nuances and all these little micro signs of things is so incredibly important. And it's the reason why, like even at the bottom, we have continuing education, because we continue to look at what trafficking looks like now, and we discuss that. So for example, like Julie's story was one that we added after. We discussed what trafficking looks like with individuals with disabilities. Kids who have a disability are significantly more likely to be trafficked than kids without. And just understanding all of those little things and understanding how things change is really important. And I hope that you guys take each of these survivor stories, because they're the ones who, they know it best. Like, I can talk up here, but it will never be even a percentage as impactful as a survivor telling their story and what that looked like, and just respecting their storytelling and the fact that it is survivor-led and trauma-informed, I think is the best way to get the training. Any other questions? Okay, thanks guys.
Thank you, Sage.